Picture a bucket of water. Not clean water, not the kind of water you pour into a glass and drink without thinking, the kind that comes cold and clear from a tap you take for granted. This water is the colour of weak tea brewed in a pot that's never been rinsed. It's warm in a way that isn't pleasant, the kind of warmth that comes from proximity to other warm things rather than any deliberate heating, and it smells like the inside of a room that has been lived in too hard for too long without the windows being opened. Now put a piece of clothing into that bucket, something that was white once. Not recently white, not white in living memory, but white in the way that a bone is white after it's been in the ground long enough. That particular grey-yellow off-white that tells you it started somewhere brighter and has been travelling steadily in the wrong direction ever since. This is a linen shift. It's an undergarment. It lives directly against human skin, pressed there by everything worn on top of it, by stays and bodice and skirt and jacket, all of it pressing the shift inward, trapping it against the body, and the body has been wearing this particular shift for 3 weeks, without washing it. 3 weeks. That's not unusual. That is, in the year of our Lord 1884, in the borough of Bermondsey in South London, a perfectly ordinary interval of time between one washing of your underlinen and the next. Not because you're lazy, not because you don't care, not because you've given up on yourself in some fundamental way, but because washing requires water, and water requires time and fuel and space and access to things that are not available to you in any straightforward manner, and also, if we're being honest about it, washing requires a second set of clothing to wear while the first set dries, and you don't have a second set. You have this. So the shift stays on. Your name is Agnes Hartley. You're 19 years old. You came to London 14 months ago from Bradford, where your father worked the wool mills until the wool mills stopped needing quite so many people. And then your father stopped working and started drinking, which is a story so common in the north of England in the 1880s that it barely counts as a story at all. You arrived at London Bridge Station with a canvas bag containing 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots, a Bible that belonged to your grandmother, and a letter from your mother's cousin who said she knew of a position in Bermondsey if you were willing to work hard and not complain. You were willing to work hard. The not complaining has been more difficult. Bermondsey in 1884 is not a place that makes complaining easy, because Bermondsey is a place that makes everything difficult. It's a tannery district, which means it's a place where animal hides are converted into leather, and the process by which this conversion happens is one of the most aggressively unpleasant industrial processes in a city that has elevated industrial unpleasantness to a kind of dark art form. The tanneries use bark and urine and dog dung, which the locals call pure, and which is collected by children who wander the streets with buckets, gathering it from every gutter and alley they can find. They steep the hides in great pits of this mixture for months. The smell that comes off those pits would stop a horse. The smell that comes off the whole district on a warm day in August is the kind of thing that stays in your clothes and your hair and the back of your throat for days after you've left it. You don't leave it very often. You've adapted to the smell the way people adapt to most things they can't change. It lives in the back of your nose now, constant as weather, and there are days when you barely notice it. There are days when the wind shifts and a gust comes off the river carrying something particularly vivid, and you notice it then, briefly, before it settles back into the general overwhelming texture of being alive in this part of London. You wake up on Tuesday morning in October with the smell of it in your hair and the stiffness of 3 weeks' worth of underlinen against your skin. And neither of these things is the first thing you notice, because the first thing you notice is the cold. The room is cold. Not the pleasant cool of an autumn morning in a house with glass in all the windows and a fireplace that's been properly laid. Not the kind of cold that makes you burrow deeper into a warm bed and feel grateful to be warm. This is the cold of a room that has been cold all night, stone cold, the cold that seeps up through the floorboards from the rooms below and down through the ceiling from the rooms above, the cold that has settled into the walls themselves and radiates outward. The fire in the grate is long out. It was never much of a fire to begin with last night, a few handfuls of coal that you and Dotty pulled money for, and it burned for a couple of hours and then it was done, and the room has been cooling steadily ever since. You share this room with Dotty Prentice and Dotty's younger sister Meg, and a woman called Mrs. Burrows, who has never told anyone her Christian name, and seems to regard the question as an impertinence. There are 2 beds in this room. You share one with Dotty. Mrs. Burrows has the other, though sometimes, if Mrs. Burrows has had a good night at the public house, she comes in late and falls asleep in the chair by the dead fire and stays there until morning, which everyone prefers because Mrs. Burrows is a restless sleeper and a person of considerable width, and the bed is not wide. Meg sleeps on the floor. You don't think about this much anymore. When you first arrived and saw the 3/4 mattress on the floor with its thin blanket and Meg curled on it like a dog finding the warmest spot, something inside you flinched. Now you see it, and you see a person sleeping, which is what it is. You sit up. The blanket falls from your shoulders. The cold hits you like something physical, like a hand laid flat against your chest, and you pull the blanket back immediately and sit there for a moment, still as possible, generating heat and dreading the moment you have to abandon it. This is the calculation that faces you every morning. On one side, the warmth of the blanket, such as it is, the temporary safety of stillness. On the other, the fact that Mrs. Beale's laundry on Blue Anchor Road opens at 7, and you need to be there when it opens or you don't get a full day's work, and a day's work is 14 pence. And 14 pence is the difference between eating and not eating, or paying your share of the coal and not paying it, or keeping your space in this bed and being asked very politely by Mr. Griggs, who owns the house, to find somewhere else. The cold wins. It always wins. You put your feet on the floor. The boards are cold even through your stockings. Not cold from the weather outside, which is ordinary October cold, the kind that numbs your fingers and pinks your cheeks but is manageable. This cold comes from below, from the damp that lives in the foundations of this building, from the proximity to the river and the tannery drainage and the general wetness of Bermondsey, which sits on low ground and drinks water from the surrounding earth like a sponge. Dotty is still asleep. She starts at 8 on Tuesdays. Lucky. You don't hate her for it. You've tried, briefly, in the small hours when you're lying awake listening to the building creak and settle and wondering what exactly that sound from the floor above was, and then morning comes and Dotty is snoring with her mouth open and her hair spread out on the pillow and her face completely untroubled, and you can't quite get to hating her. She's kind. She shares the coal money without counting too carefully. When you first arrived and didn't know which streets to take after dark, she walked you home. You dress quickly because there's no virtue in taking your time. Your outer dress goes over the shift, then the skirt over that, then the bodice, then the shawl. No stays today. You can't bear stays in the cold of the morning, the way the boning sits rigid against your ribs until your body heat warms it up, and by then you're already at work and already exhausted from being cold and rigid for an hour before you've done anything. Mrs. Beale doesn't look at your stays. She looks at your hands. You check your hands in the dim light from the small window. The knuckles are cracked from the work of last week, from the hot water and the lye soap and the wringing, from the way the cold bites into places that are already damaged. There's a split on the side of your right index finger that opened again yesterday, and then dried shut overnight into a thin brown line that will open again the moment you put your hands in water, which will be approximately 35 minutes from now. You wrap a strip of old cloth around it. It won't help much, it never does. Breakfast is bread and a scraping of dripping from the pot Mrs. Burrows keeps on the shelf, which you're allowed to use because you bought a portion of it last week when Mrs. Burrows got the dripping cheap from the butcher's boy. The bread is 3 days old. You don't notice this. The street outside is already moving when you come down. This is the thing about Bermondsey that took you a while to understand. It never quite sleeps, and it wakes early and completely, without the gradual gathering of energy that seems to happen in other places. The tanneries start their work before light. The doss houses disgorge their occupants at first light because staying in costs extra. By the time you reach Blue Anchor Road at 6:10 in the morning, there are already men loading carts outside the leather works, and women with baskets heading toward the market, and children moving in their particular way, which is always either running or standing absolutely still, nothing in between. The air is cold and it smells of the river, and below that the tanneries, and below that the particular Bermondsey smell that you can never quite name, which is a combination of the organic processes of a very crowded neighbourhood, of outhouses and gutters, and the effluvia of too many humans in too small a space. Not an unusual smell in 1880s London. Every district has its version of it. But Bermondsey's version has the tannery notes underneath it, the sulphur and bark and the sharper edge of the pure pots. And it gives the whole thing a particular quality that you will associate for the rest of your life with this period, with being 19 and cold and a long way from Bradford. You walk quickly. You know the route well enough to do it without thinking, which means you can dedicate most of your attention to the other thing you've been thinking about for 3 days, the bathhouse. There's a public bath on Grange Road. This is not a secret. It's been there since 1860-something, one of the new borough bathhouses that the reformers pushed the vestry into building, one of the places where, for 1 penny, you can have a private bath in hot water, clean water, new water that hasn't been used by someone else, that hasn't been hauled in a bucket from a standpipe and then left to sit in a room where it picks up everything the room contains. You've walked past it several times. You've looked at the notice board outside. First class bath, 2 pence. Second class bath, 1 penny. Towel provided. Towel provided. You've never been inside. This is the thing about poverty that people who haven't experienced it sometimes misunderstand. The way it works, not just in large catastrophic ways, but in small constant ones. The way it builds a kind of internal logic that makes certain things feel impossible, even when they are technically not. A penny bath costs a penny. You earn 14 pence on a full working day. A penny is not mathematically an impossible sum, but a penny is also a third of what you spend on food in a day, if you're eating carefully, which you are. A penny is the contribution toward the coal that keeps the room warm enough to sleep. A penny is the margin that sits between having exactly enough and not quite having enough. And when you're living on the border between those two things, every penny has to be justified in ways that pennies don't have to be justified for people who have more of them. Also, and this is harder to explain, there's the time. A bath takes time. The bathhouse closes at 8 in the evening, and on weekdays you sometimes don't finish at Mrs. Beale's until 7, and by the time you walk there it's too late. And on Saturdays you work until 6, and then there's the marketing to do if you've got the money for it. And Sundays you could go. Theoretically, Sundays are the obvious time, but Sunday's the one morning you sleep past 6. The one morning the alarm in your chest doesn't go off at 5:30, and that extra hour of sleep is something you guard fiercely, irrationally, the way you guard nothing else. So you haven't gone. You've been in London for 14 months, and you've not had a bath. You have washed, in pieces, face and hands, every morning in the basin with the brown water, more thoroughly on Sunday evenings when Dotty heats a pot on the small stove and you take turns washing, going behind the curtain that Mrs. Burrows rigged up from an old blanket and using a cloth and soap, working through what you can reach. Hair once a month roughly, maybe less, because hair takes water and time and drying time, and winter is coming, and wet hair in a cold room is an invitation to the kind of cough that killed Mrs. Burrows' sister 2 winters ago. But a full bath, lying in actual warm water, being clean in a complete way rather than the constant partial way. 3 weeks since you last changed your shift. That's what keeps pulling at you. Not the philosophical question of personal hygiene, the very specific physical reality of this garment that you are currently wearing, that has been against your skin for 3 weeks, that carries the smell and the texture and the record of 3 weeks of your physical existence. You know exactly how it smells. You stopped being able to smell it on yourself days ago, which is how the human nose works. You adapt to your own smell faster than to any other smell. But you know from the way Meg looked at you yesterday when you were close to her, that particular tightening of the nostrils that people do when they're trying not to react, that the shift smells, that you smell. This matters. It matters more than you've been allowing yourself to think about. Mrs. Beale's laundry is a long, low building at the back of a yard off Blue Anchor Road, and it is, at 6:45 in the morning, already warm inside from the copper boilers that have been going since 5. This is the particular cruelty of laundry work. You spend your days in a hot, wet, soapy environment, your hands submerged in water that starts scalding and then cools to merely hot, your clothes soaked through with steam, your hair clinging to your neck, your whole body damp and overheated, and then you go home in October to a cold room with no fire, and the contrast is so violent it takes 10 minutes in bed to stop shaking. There are 6 women who work here regularly. Sarah, who is 30, and has been here 11 years, and runs the copper boiler with a precision that is almost frightening. Bess, who is Sarah's daughter and learning the trade. Mary Kate, who is Irish and doesn't talk much, but works faster than anyone Agnes has ever seen. A woman known only as Old Grace, who's maybe 55, maybe 70. It's difficult to know, and who has hands like leather and can carry a full basket of wet washing that would floor most men. You, and Ellen, who is new, 2 months in, who still winces when she puts her hands in the lye water. Ellen is 16 and from Suffolk, and looks at London the way a rabbit looks at an open field, like there's something coming from a direction she hasn't identified yet. You remember being Ellen. You do not have time to be gentle about this. Mrs. Beale runs a hard establishment. Not cruel, not dishonest, but hard in the sense that the work is hard, and the expectations match the work, and there's no particular allowance made for anyone's inexperience or discomfort, or the fact that their hands are splitting. She's a stout woman in her 50s, with grey hair scraped back from a face that has lines in it, like a landscape seen from above, and she greets you each morning by looking at your hands, and if they're wrapped in cloth, which yours often are, she looks at the cloth and then at you with an expression that contains several things at once, none of them particularly warm, but none of them dismissive either. "Hartley," she says this morning. "Morning, Mrs. Beale." She hands you the first basket without further comment. The work begins. The laundry that comes into Mrs. Beale's establishment represents, in its way, one of the more direct points of contact between the class of people who work in Bermondsey and the class of people who live in the houses to the north and west of the river. The shirts and sheets and petticoats and underlinen that arrive in the baskets and hampers every Monday and Tuesday come from households in Mayfair and Kensington and Belgravia, where they have been worn or used and then set aside for collection, because washing is something that happens elsewhere, in a different part of the city, performed by different kinds of people. The linens are white. Even the used ones, the ones being brought in for washing, are a kind of white that is almost aggressive about its own quality. They have been white for years, and they stay white because they are washed regularly, sometimes weekly, because the households they come from have the money for regular washing and the staff to manage it, and the closets full of enough changes of linen that nothing ever has to stay on past its time. The difference between these linens and your own shift is visible the moment you hold them, not just in colour, though the colour is striking, but in the texture. Good linen has a particular hand to it, a coolness against the fingers, a slight resistance followed by a give, a smoothness that comes from both quality of material and quality of care. Your shift is cotton, not linen, cheap cotton, and it has been washed in the way that cheap things in poor households are washed, which is to say, occasionally and with cold water and whatever soap was available, and then dried in whatever space was available, and worn and sweated in and worn again. And at 19 you know perfectly well that the texture of your own underlinen is nothing like the texture of the things you handle every day. You know this in the way, you know lots of things about your situation, clearly, specifically, without much drama. It's just the way things are. But sometimes, and this is the thing you don't say out loud, sometimes when you're handling one of these fine white shifts, these soft cotton or linen garments that have had the luxury of being changed every few days and washed in proper hot water and dried properly and pressed with a good flat iron, sometimes you think about what it would be like to wear one. Not even to own one necessarily. Just to wear something like this against your skin once. Just to know what the difference felt like. Then you put it in the copper and you get on with the work. The copper is a large iron pot set over a furnace in the floor, and it holds maybe 20 gallons of water, and the water is boiling, and you use a long wooden paddle to move the washing round inside it, and the steam comes up in clouds that wet your face and your hair and get inside your collar and the front of your dress. And the paddle is heavy, especially after the first hour, especially when the muscles in your arms and shoulders start registering their objections, which they always do after the first hour. The sound of the laundry is something you've gotten so used to that you mostly don't hear it anymore. The slosh and heave of the copper, the rhythmic sound of scrubbing on the washboard, the clap and thump of wet cloth on stone, the hiss of the flat iron on the ironing board, the voices of the women who talk or don't talk, who sing sometimes, who argue sometimes, who work in the particular focused silence of people doing physical work that requires most of their attention. Sarah sings today, hymns, always hymns, the same 5 or 6 that she rotates through, and she sings them very quietly, almost under her breath, so that you hear the tune more than the words. It's not unpleasant. It gives the morning a kind of rhythm. By 9 o'clock your split knuckle has opened again through the cloth wrapping. You knew it would. You keep working. The water in the rinsing tub is cooling and you have to change it, which means going to the standpipe in the yard and filling the bucket and carrying it back twice, 3 times. The bucket weighs about 40 pounds when it's full. The yard is uneven and the bucket swings and the water sloshes and some of it inevitably goes on your boots. Your boots are not waterproof. By 11 your feet are cold and damp and your back has developed the particular ache that comes from bending over the wash tub, a horizontal bar of pain just above your hips that you've learned to work through because there is no not working through it. There's just working and then going home. You're wringing out a shirt, both hands twisted in opposite directions, the water streaming out and down your wrists and arms, when Mary Kate says, without looking up from the washboard, "You go in Saturday?" Saturday is when Mrs. Beale gives half a day, noon finish. Everyone knows what she means. Maybe, you say, which means yes. You made the decision 3 days ago, in the middle of the night, in the particular clarity of 4 in the morning when there's nothing to distract you from the thoughts you've been avoiding. You're going to the bathhouse. This Saturday. It costs a penny, and it requires giving up 40 minutes on the one afternoon you have for yourself. But you've been telling yourself you'd go for 6 months and you haven't gone, and the shift has been on for 3 weeks, and the split knuckle will not heal properly as long as it's going in and out of dirty water every day and something has to change. Saturday. The penny bath. It seems like a small thing, the kind of thing that should require no particular courage or resolution. You wash yourself. People do it. People do it all the time. In your mother's kitchen in Bradford, there was a tin bath that you dragged out on Saturday nights and filled from the pot on the range, and it was cold by the time the second person got in, and the water was grey by the time the third person got in. But it happened. It was a thing that happened regularly. But Bradford seems like it happened to a different person. And the tin bath with a pot on the range requires a range to put the pot on, requires a kitchen, requires a door you can close, requires the kind of basic domestic infrastructure that does not exist in the 2/3 of a room you currently occupy in Bermondsey. The question of how people keep clean in the poorest parts of Victorian London is a question that reformers and sanitary inspectors and temperance campaigners and assorted worried members of the middle classes have been asking out loud for decades. They write pamphlets about it. They give lectures. They visit. They peer into rooms like yours with expressions of horrified concern and then go home and write reports. What none of them quite grasp, or what they grasp but don't sit with for long enough, is that the problem is not primarily a problem of values or priorities or education. It is not that the people who live 3 families to a room in Bermondsey have failed to understand the importance of cleanliness. It is not that they haven't heard of soap. The problem is the infrastructure of cleanliness and the way that infrastructure is distributed across the city in exact proportion to wealth. Clean water for a start. In 1884, clean piped water does not reach most of Bermondsey. There are standpipes in the yards, shared between the residents of several houses, and the water that comes from these pipes is sometimes clean, and sometimes not particularly clean, and occasionally actively dangerous. The great cholera epidemics of mid-century, the ones that killed tens of thousands of Londoners, were waterborne, tracked back by John Snow in 1854 to a single pump on Broad Street in Soho, a discovery that was revolutionary and is still being slowly absorbed into the management of London's water supply with mixed results. By 1884, things are better. The germ theory of disease is gaining ground. Pasteur's work has spread from France. The sanitary reformers who've been screaming about sewage and water supply for 30 years are being proved right in ways that even the most complacent vestry board can't ignore. The great sewerage network that Bazalgette built through the 1860s has changed the smell of the Thames in central London from something genuinely lethal to something merely unpleasant, which is a significant improvement. Cholera, after the epidemic of 1866, has retreated. But retreated is not gone. And the standpipe in your yard, which serves 23 people across 3 houses, is shared with the drainage from the outhouses, and the outhouses are 20 feet away, and the ground between them is not particularly well sealed. You think about this sometimes, at the washboard. You think about the water going in and out of your hands, the water you use to wash your face in the morning. The reformers say that filth causes disease. They're right about the mechanism, even if they're still confused about some of the details. The word in the newspapers and the pamphlets that pile up sometimes in Mrs. Beale's waste bin is contagion, which is Latin for something, and it means that sickness travels from person to person by contact, by proximity, by the sharing of water and air and space. The irony of washing other people's linens for money while being unable to wash your own is not lost on you. You've noticed it the way you notice lots of things about your situation, clearly, specifically, with the flat acknowledgement of someone who has used up their capacity for outrage on more immediate problems. By noon, the first round of sheets is done and hanging in the drying room, which is a long shed at the back of the yard where lines are strung close together, and the steam from wet linen has been condensing on the walls and ceiling for years until they're perpetually damp and slightly green. The smell of the drying room is one of the better smells you've encountered in Bermondsey. Hot cotton and washing soda and something almost clean underneath it all. Something that is the ghost of the cleanliness being restored to these items. You eat dinner in the yard, bread again, a piece of cold potato, a cup of tea from Mrs. Beale's kitchen that has been stewed so long it's almost black, but it's hot, and it's sweet from the sugar she puts in it. And in October at noon in Bermondsey, hot and sweet is sufficient. Ellen sits next to you on the bench. She picked up a bruise on her forearm from the mangle, which everyone who works the mangle gets eventually. The big rollers that squeeze the water out of the washing, and that will put your hand through if you're not paying attention, which Ellen clearly wasn't for a moment. She's looking at it with the expression of someone calculating whether this constitutes an injury worth mentioning or something you just absorb and keep going. You absorb it and keep going. That's the answer. "Does your back hurt?" she asks. "Yes." "All the time?" You stop noticing it after a month or 2. This is not entirely true. You notice it every evening when you straighten up from the last task of the day, and something in your lower spine makes a sound, and the bar of pain above your hips flares for a moment, before settling back into its usual dull presence. But you notice it less acutely, which is not the same thing, but is what she needs to hear right now. She nods, eats her bread in small, careful bites, the way people eat when they're not sure when the next meal is coming. You remember that calculation too. "The bathhouse," she says suddenly. "What about it? Have you been? To the one on Grange Road?" She says it carefully, like she's been working up to the question. "Not yet." You pause. "Saturday. I want to go." Very quiet, almost embarrassed. "I've been meaning to go since I got here, but I kept..." She stops. "Yeah. My mum said you should go every week, that you'd get sick if you didn't." She's picking at the bread crust now. "She said the water here's different to Suffolk water, and you have to be more careful. Your mother said the same kind of thing, more or less. Not about water specifically, more about keeping yourself respectable. about what it means to be clean in a city where everything is trying to make you dirty. Your mother scrubbed the kitchen floor every Saturday and changed the bed linens every 2 weeks and boiled everything that needed boiling. And she did this with water carried from a pump 3 streets away and heated on a range that burned coal they sometimes couldn't afford. And she did it in a house with 4 people in 3 rooms. And she regarded it as the fundamental work of a civilized life. Your mother would not approve of 3 weeks in the same shift. Your mother would also understand, if you could explain it to her, which you couldn't, how the 3 weeks happened. How the first week was just the first week, and the second week was the second week, and by the third week you'd passed some invisible threshold past which the practical difficulties of doing something about it had accumulated to the point where it felt less possible, not more, even though nothing material had changed. "Come Saturday then," you say to Ellen. "I'm going at noon." She looks at you with the particular expression of someone who has just been given permission for something they'd been afraid to want. It's a complicated expression. You recognize it. The afternoon is ironing. Ironing in a laundry in 1884 is not a small domestic task. It's an industrial process performed in a room kept hot enough to maintain the irons at working temperature, which means a room where the fire in the grate can't go out, and where the air is thick and dry and sits in your lungs like something solid. The irons themselves are heavy flat irons, maybe 8 pounds each, that you heat on the grate and then test on a cloth and then use until they cool and swap for the next one. Each iron cools in about 3 minutes of working. You have 6 to cycle through. Your right arm drives the iron. Your left hand stretches the fabric. The split on your right index finger is protected by the cloth wrapping, which is now wet through from the steam, which means the split is wet, which means it hurts in the particular singing way of wet splits. A sort of slow, high-pitched pain rather than the sharp pain of the split actually opening, which is worse. The shirt you're ironing is a fine white cotton shirt with a stiff collar and cuffs. The collar and cuffs are the difficult part, the starched parts, the parts that require the iron to be hottest and the pressure to be firmest, and the arm to work at the exact right angle, and you've gotten good at this over 14 months. Good enough that Mrs. Beale gives you the collars and cuffs without comment, which is her version of a compliment. The man who wears this shirt has never ironed anything in his life. Possibly he has never thought about the process by which his shirts arrive in his wardrobe pressed and white. Possibly the shirts simply seem to him to appear that way, the way that bread seems to appear in the bread basket and coal seems to appear in the scuttle and hot water seems to appear in the washing stand pitcher in the morning, because the people who produce these effects are invisible to him, operating in a different layer of the household's reality. You're not resentful about this. You think about it the way you think about most things about your situation, which is to say steadily, without much heat. Resentment requires energy that you need for other things. But you think about it. You think about whose hands have touched the things you handle, and whose hands have never touched the things you need, and the particular mathematics of exchange that runs underneath all of Victorian London, like the drains run underneath the streets, massive and invisible, and occasionally, when something goes badly wrong, unavoidable. The shirt takes 12 minutes. You start the next one. By 4 o'clock there's a headache sitting behind your eyes that you recognize as the dehydration headache. The one you get when you've been working in the steam all day and haven't drunk enough, because drinking requires stopping work to drink, which requires deciding to stop work, which feels difficult when there's still work to do. You drink a cup of water from the pitcher by the door. It tastes of iron and something else, something mineral, and it does not taste clean the way water sometimes tastes clean, cool, and almost sweet. The way the water in Bradford used to taste coming off the moors before it reached the town. But you drink it, and the headache retreats slightly. Outside, through the small high window of the ironing room, the light is changing. October light in London is different from October light in Bradford, which was different from summer light everywhere. Clearer and more slanted and more golden before it went. October light in Bermondsey has the coal smoke in it, the particular amber quality that comes from filtering daylight through the permanent haze that sits over South London like a second sky, and it makes everything look slightly warmer than it is, which is a small mercy. You finish at 6:30. Mrs. Beale pays you at the door, counting out the coins into your palm with the speed and accuracy of someone who has done this thousands of times. 14 pence for a full day. She adds a halfpenny that she doesn't explain, which is her way of acknowledging, without acknowledging it, that you did the collars and cuffs without complaint. You put the coins in the small cloth purse you keep inside your bodice next to your skin. Not because you're being romantic about money, because it's the safest place in Bermondsey. The walk home is 20 minutes, and it takes you through streets that are filling up with the end of the day. Men coming off the tanneries with their hands dark and their clothes smelling of the work. Women carrying packages. Children who should probably be in school, or at least inside somewhere warm, running between people's legs with the focused energy of children who have nowhere particular to be and are making the most of it. 2 men outside the public house on Tanner Street arguing about something with a particular exhausted aggression of people who've been working since dawn and have found their way to the place where the day ends and the long evening begins. A cart horse, enormous and indifferent, stands in the middle of the road while its driver negotiates with someone about something, and the traffic backs up behind it into a tangle of carts and a barrow boy and a woman with a perambulator who is pushing her way through with the single-minded determination of someone who has somewhere to be, and a great tolerance for inconvenience. You step around all of it automatically. 14 months ago, you would have stopped for the horse. You would have stood there waiting for the road to clear, Bradford cautious, all polite. Now you move through the gaps the way water moves through gaps, finding the path of least resistance with the efficiency of a person who has learned the city's rhythms well enough to use them. The room is cold again, of course. Dotty is home before you, sitting on the bed with a candle, sewing something in the small circle of light. She looks up when you come in. "I've saved you some stew," she says. "Mrs. Burrows made too much." Mrs. Burrows making too much stew is a miracle roughly equivalent, in the domestic economy of this room, to the loaves and the fishes. You eat it standing by the window because the stool is occupied by Meg's things, and it's thin stew, mostly potato with some unidentified meat and onion, but it's warm and it fills the hole that 14 hours of work has left. "Saturday," Dotty says, without looking up from her sewing. "What about it?" You're going to the baths. You're about to ask how she knows this, and then you remember that Ellen knows, and Ellen and Dotty both know the woman who sells herrings 2 streets over, and that woman talks to everyone. "Yeah," you say, "I'll lend you the penny." "I've got a penny. Take mine anyway, in case." She says it without looking up, threading a needle with the concentrated attention of someone doing close work in inadequate light. In case means in case something happens between now and Saturday. In case the halfpenny Mrs. Beale gave you has to go on coal or bread or the week's lodging. In case the penny you're planning to spend on the bath becomes a penny you've got to spend on something more immediate. She's not wrong to anticipate this. Money in the world you both live in has a particular way of going to wherever it's most needed. and most needed often outranks wanted, and the bath is a wanted thing. But this Saturday you decide the wanted thing is going to win. You fall asleep thinking about it, which is not something you've done before about a bath. You fall asleep thinking about hot water and thinking about the shift that you will take off on Saturday and not put back on, and you fall asleep thinking about the particular quality of being clean in a complete way, and whether you can still remember what that feels like. Wednesday morning is cold and grey, and the split on your knuckle is worse, and the headache from yesterday is still there, dimmed but present, sitting behind your left eye like a small bad thought. The standpipe in the yard is dripping because someone didn't close it properly, and there's a puddle of frozen water around the base that you step around without looking at it directly. The day at Mrs. Beale's is essentially identical to Tuesday. This is not a complaint. Routine is its own kind of shelter. What changes is the delivery. Wednesday afternoons, sometimes there's a new intake from one of the bigger households, and today the intake includes a hamper from a house in Bloomsbury, one of Mrs. Beale's better customers, a household that sends its washing religiously every fortnight and pays promptly. You're unpacking it when something near the bottom of the hamper stops you. It's a petticoat. Fine white cotton, broderie anglaise trim on the hem, finely stitched. It's dirty, clearly, it's here to be washed. But even in its current state, the quality of it is immediately apparent in the way the fabric moves in your hands. Not stiff, not clinging, not the heavy, reluctant quality of cloth that has been wearing itself out. This is cloth that has been properly looked after and is showing it, responding to your hands with a suppleness that says it's been treated well, washed at the right intervals, stored properly, not left to go stale. The hem has a small tear. Not big, maybe 2 inches, where the lace has caught on something. Nothing that can't be mended. You hold it for a moment too long. Old Grace passing behind you with a basket says nothing, but you feel her looking at you, and you put the petticoat down and get on with the sorting. But you keep thinking about it through the afternoon, which is not specifically about the petticoat, but about what the petticoat represents, which is the basic material right to cleanliness, to not wearing your own body's residue against your skin for weeks at a time, to the ordinary physical decency of clean underlinen. You think about it while you're scrubbing and ironing, and your split knuckle is singing its continuous small note of pain. And by the end of the afternoon you've worked yourself into a state of quiet, determined anger that is not loud enough to be useful to anyone, but is specific enough to be useful to you. Saturday. The bath. Non-negotiable. Thursday it rains. Rain in Bermondsey is its own particular experience. The district is low enough that rain doesn't drain away so much as redistribute, finding the cracks in the paving and the low spots in the yards and the already saturated ground under the houses, and settling into pools that don't so much puddle as lake, that you have to navigate on your way to and from work. The Blue Anchor Road becomes a river of brown water at the edges, and the yard outside Mrs. Beale's develops a pool by the drying room door that you have to jump over, and you misjudge it Thursday afternoon, and land with your right foot in the puddle, and your boot fills with cold brown water and stays wet for the rest of the day. This is not catastrophic. It's barely even remarkable. It is just Thursday in October in Bermondsey. What it does, the wet boot, is add another layer to the argument for Saturday. Not just the shift, the whole of yourself. The boots aired and stuffed with paper, and the stockings washed and the feet clean and dry. The whole project of being a person who takes up physical space in the world without the constant accompaniment of discomfort. You understand, in a way that you couldn't have articulated when you were in Bradford, why people in bad circumstances drink. Not the specific self-destruction of it, the part where gin at twopence a cup does what it does, but the underlying appetite for relief, for the sensation of having escaped the physical reality of your own life for a few hours. You don't drink, or not much, not beyond the occasional cup of ale that Dottie shares on a good night, but you understand it. What you do instead, which is probably not as effective, is think about Saturday. Friday is dry and cold and unremarkable, except that Mrs. Beale asks you, at the end of the day, whether you'd be able to come in for a few hours on Saturday morning. There's a rush job, a set of altar cloths from a church that needs them back by Sunday, and she needs people who can be trusted with altar cloths, which are heavily embroidered and require particular attention. You say yes. Of course you say yes. That's an extra penny and a half. She says she'll be done by 11, which means you can still make the bathhouse by noon, which means Saturday is still possible. You hold this fact carefully on the walk home, like something that could break if you grip it too hard. The altar cloths are red and gold and extraordinarily heavy in the way that things embroidered with actual metal thread are heavy, and they require to be washed cold rather than hot because the embroidery can't take the copper, and they have to be handled gently in the rinsing tub and pressed at a lower temperature with a cloth between the iron and the embroidery to protect it. And the whole process takes 4 times as long as an equivalent weight of ordinary linen, but they are also, when you hold them up in the light to check for remaining marks, genuinely beautiful in the way that things made with tremendous skill and care for a long time tend to be beautiful, the kind of beauty that is historical and accumulated rather than simply decorative. You handle them with the care they need. Mrs. Beale watches, not interfering, which is the most approval she typically offers. You finish at 11:15. She pays you a penny and 3 farthings. You put it with the rest. Ellen is waiting outside, which you didn't expect. Her coat is buttoned up to the chin and her hat is pulled down, and she looks cold and nervous and pleased to see you. "I thought you'd forget," she says. "I didn't forget." You walk to the bathhouse together. The public baths and washhouses of Victorian London are, in the context of their time, a genuine and specific act of civic imagination. They were created by the Baths and Washhouses Act of 1846, which gave municipal authorities the power to build and operate public bathing facilities. The theory being that if clean water was not going to come to the poor in their homes, then the poor could come to the clean water in a public building. The first public bath in London opened in 1846 in George Street, Whitechapel. By the 1880s, there are dozens of them scattered across the metropolitan boroughs, each one an architectural argument for the proposition that working-class people deserve access to hot water. The one on Grange Road is not grand. It's a brick building, 2 stories, functional, with a notice board outside listing the tariffs and the hours, and a rule about no more than 3 people in a changing cubicle at once. The sign says, "Borough of Bermondsey Public Baths and Washhouses." Below it in smaller type, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." You've walked past it dozens of times and never gone in. You go in. The lobby smells of soap and damp stone and the particular sharp mineral smell of municipal water running through pipes, and it is warmer than outside, which you feel immediately on your face and hands. A woman behind a counter with a collected, efficient manner looks up when you come in. "Second class?" "Yes. 1 penny each." You pay. She hands you each a towel and a small piece of soap and a ticket. The towel is coarse and grey and thin and absolutely without any cosmetic appeal whatsoever, and it is the most welcome thing you've been given in 14 months. Number 7, number 8, she says, gesturing toward a corridor. 20 minutes. 20 minutes is the allowed time for a second-class bath. After 20 minutes, someone knocks on the door, and if you don't come out, they knock harder. The bathhouse serves a large number of people, and the baths need to turn over. 20 minutes is plenty. The corridor has a row of doors on each side, each with a number, each behind a door that is solid enough for privacy, which is not something you've had much of lately. You go into number 7. Ellen takes number 8. The room is small, maybe 5 feet by 7. There's a bath, cast iron, deep enough to lie in, with 2 taps, hot and cold. There's a hook on the wall for your clothes and a wooden mat on the floor to stand on. The walls are white tile, worn in places, clean. The floor is white tile. The drain in the bottom of the bath is slightly rusted. The tap is slightly lime-scaled. Everything is old and used and entirely adequate. You turn the hot tap. Water comes out. Hot water. Not warm, not tepid, not the barely warmer than cold water that comes out of the pot on the stove after you've been heating it for 20 minutes and then waited for it to cool enough to use. Hot water. Proper scalding hot water that you turn down slightly with the cold tap and then stand and watch filling the bath for a moment. Just watching. The steam rising, the water turning. You undress. This is a moment that requires description, not because it is dramatic, but because it is not dramatic. Because the stripping off of 3 weeks of underlinen should feel extraordinary, and instead feels like removing something that has fused to your skin, like peeling something. The shift comes off over your head. The stockings, the stays, everything. You look at the shift in your hands for a moment. This grey-yellow thing that has been your daily skin for 3 weeks, and you notice the smell of it now. Now that it's separate from you. Now that your nose isn't adapted to it. It smells of coal smoke and the tannery and sweat and the particular rancid animal smell of unwashed human, and it is objectively quite bad. You put it on the floor, not on the hook with your dress, on the floor. You get in the bath. The heat of the water is extraordinary, not just warm, not just comfortable, but hot in a way that feels almost violent. The way the body registers sudden heat as threat before registering it as relief, and you lower yourself in slowly, letting the temperature negotiate with your skin, and then you're in, fully in, and the water closes over you and you lie still for a moment. 14 months. The grime comes off your skin in a visible way. You can see it in the water, which is clear when it fills, but within 2 minutes has a faint grey tinge, the visual record of everything your skin has been accumulating. You use the soap, the municipal soap, which is harder and less fragrant than the bar in your mother's kitchen in Bradford, but which lathers adequately and does the work, and you wash everything thoroughly, methodically, beginning at the top and working down, taking the time that the work requires. Your hands. You've been so focused on your hands as instruments, as things that hurt and need protection and do the work, that you've stopped thinking of them as your own hands, as hands that belong to a person rather than a job. The water and the soap go into the cracks in the knuckles which sting viciously, the split on the index finger opening completely, and then in the warm water, releasing something, relaxing, the tension of the dried blood going out of it. You wash your hair. This is slower. This requires going under and coming up and working the soap through until it lathers and then rinsing and feeling under your hands The difference between hair coated with accumulated stuff and hair that is just hair. The split ends are still there. The grey colour of London living doesn't come out in one wash. But underneath all of that, you find your own hair. 20 minutes. You don't want to get out, you get out. The towel is rough enough to be almost medicinal, and you use it on everything. And then you stand in the small steamy room and dress. And the dress and the skirt and the bodice go back on. And then you pick up the shift from the floor and you look at it for a moment. You brought a clean shift. This is the reason you've been saving the second half of a clean shift that Dottie gave you 3 weeks ago when she found it at the rag market, a cotton shift that someone had sold or discarded, that Dottie bought for a halfpenny because she knew you were down to one. You've been carrying it in your bag for 3 days, waiting for Saturday. You put it on, under everything else. The difference is immediate and physical. The way the clean fabric moves against your skin differently from the worn fabric, lighter and cooler and less present, not sticking, not dragging, not the slight resistance of fabric that's been through too much wearing and not enough washing. You put your dress on over it and stand very still for a moment. You are clean. You are, in this moment, completely and properly clean, in a way that you haven't been for 14 months, and the sensation is so specific and so unlike anything you've been experiencing for such a long time that you just stand in the small tiled room and breathe, feeling the air come in and go out and the heat of the bath still working through your muscles. Someone knocks on the door. 20 minutes. Coming. Ellen is in the lobby when you come out. Her hair damp, her cheeks pink from the heat, an expression on her face that you recognise as the exact expression you're probably also wearing. Slightly dazed, slightly overwhelmed by the gap between what was and what is now. That was, she starts. Yeah. You go out into the street. The cold air hits you, and the Bermondsey smell hits you, and the tanneries are doing whatever it is the tanneries do on Saturday afternoons, and the yard back at your building will be cold, and Mrs. Burrows will be in the chair, and the standpipe will be dripping, and none of that has changed. But you are clean underneath all of it. You are clean all the way down to your skin, in a way that no one looking at you from the outside can know, in a way that exists entirely in your own private physical experience. It is, and you allow yourself this thought fully without diminishing it. It is enough. You've been in London for 14 months, and you've learned to make the calculation between enough and not enough dozens of times a day, about food and heat and sleep and money, and the 1,000 small negotiations of staying alive in a city that doesn't care particularly whether you do. You've learned to apply the word enough accurately without inflation to the things that are genuinely enough and not to the things that aren't. This is enough. The walk home takes 20 minutes and your feet are dry for the first time since Thursday, and the split on your knuckle has stopped singing quite so loudly and the headache is gone. And you walk through the Saturday market on Bermondsey Street just to walk through it. Not because you have money for anything, just to walk through the smell of the Saturday market. The fish and the hot food and the fresh bread and the flowers someone is selling from a barrow. Paper-wrapped bunches of chrysanthemums the colour of autumn. And you think about your mother's kitchen and the tin bath and the water that went grey by the time it got to you. And you think about the shift that is in your bag, the dirty shift, and whether you can wash it tonight and whether it will dry by Monday. You think about next Saturday, not next month, next Saturday. Because here is the thing about the penny bath. The thing that the reformers who built it were right about, even if they were wrong about some of the reasons. Once you've been, once you know what it's like, the calculus changes. The penny is still a penny. The 20 minutes is still 20 minutes. But both of those things, which felt impossible before, feel entirely possible now. Possible in the way that a known path through a familiar wood feels different from a path through unknown dark, even if it's the same distance, even if it's the same ground. You know the way now. Next Saturday. The chrysanthemums on the flower barrow are the kind of orange that happens at this time of year and no other. A deep rusty orange that looks warm even in the cold light of October afternoon in Bermondsey, and the woman selling them has a red nose and a cheerful face and is telling someone about her sister-in-law's wedding in a voice that carries half the length of the market, and you walk past and you don't buy anything and it doesn't matter. You have your clean shift on. You're 14 months into becoming a Londoner. The bathhouse on Grange Road is 11 minutes from your door. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. Dotty is awake when you get home, sitting on the bed with her feet tucked under her, eating an apple with the focused pleasure of someone eating something that doesn't need to be stretched or rationed or supplemented. She looks up when you come in. She doesn't ask how it was. She looks at your face and she knows. Mrs. Burrows, she says, dropping her voice, said it was a waste of a penny. Mrs. Burrows thinks everything's a waste of a penny. She bathes, Dotty says. Apparently, her cousin has a tin bath. You take off your coat and hang it on the hook behind the door. The room smells the same as always, the particular evening smell of it. Coal smoke and damp and the faint residual smell of the tanneries that has seeped into the walls over years of Bermondsey existence. It smells the same. You are different inside it. Meg is on the floor with a piece of mending. She's 12 and quiet and does a great deal of small domestic work that nobody specifically asked her to do. The kind of invisible maintenance labour that falls to the youngest person in a room by some principle that predates memory. She looks up at you with the particular direct gaze of a child who notices things and doesn't mention them. Your hair's different, she says. I washed it. She considers this for a moment, nods, goes back to her mending. You sit on the edge of the bed and you feel the clean shift against your skin, and you let yourself feel it without qualifying it. Tomorrow there will be more of the same work. Next week will be cold, and the week after that will be colder. The split on your knuckle will heal and then split again as it always does. Mrs. Beale will look at your hands every morning and hand you the first basket without comment, and the copper will steam and the ironing room will be hot and airless. None of that changes, but you've been clean today, and you will be clean again next Saturday and the Saturday after that, and the shift you washed in the tub tonight with the end of the soap is hanging from the line Dotty rigged between the window and the nail on the opposite wall, and by Monday morning it will be dry, and you will have 2 shifts in rotation instead of 1. Small, specific, real. Dotty finishes her apple and says, as if continuing a conversation she's been having with herself for some time, my mother says you should change your underlinen once a week at minimum. She says that's what separates respectable people from people who've given up. Your mother's right. She also says you should sleep with a bag of camphor around your neck to prevent infection, and that you should never drink Thames water even boiled, and that the night air in London causes rheumatism. Some of that's probably right too. The camphor definitely doesn't work. Dotty lies back on the bed. Ellen came round before you got back. Said she's going every Saturday. Said she can't believe she waited 2 months. No one goes until they go, you say, and then they can't understand why they didn't go before. This is something you understand now with the clarity of personal experience, and it seems important in a way that extends beyond the specific question of whether you bathe. It's the problem of the impossible thing that turns out not to be impossible. The way a threshold that looks impassable from one side looks perfectly passable once you've crossed it and looked back. The penny bath looked like something that required conditions you didn't have, and it turned out to require 1 penny and 20 minutes on a Saturday, and the conditions were exactly those two things and nothing else. You wonder how many things in your life have that quality, the quality of appearing more difficult than they are because you're looking at them from the wrong side. You fall asleep before you can answer that question, which is probably the right outcome. Sunday morning is grey and cold and entirely without event, which is exactly what Sunday morning should be. You lie in bed until 7, which is the luxury, the extra hour, the thing you refuse to give up for months, even for the bath, and then you get up because staying in bed past the body's willingness to stay is its own kind of punishment, the restless wakefulness that's worse than getting up. Dotty goes to church. She's regular about it, not from strong conviction as far as you can tell, but from the structure of it, the 1 hour a week that is purely non-transactional, where nothing is being bought or sold or negotiated, and the building is warm and you can sit down without being moved on. The church on Bermondsey Street has a working-class congregation that the vicar treats, from what Dotty has described, with the basic human courtesy of not mentioning their poverty as a character flaw, which apparently makes it unusual enough to be worth the walk. You don't go. You've gone twice since arriving in London, both times in the early weeks when you were still operating on Bradford norms, and both times you came out feeling more conscious of your own position rather than less, which is the opposite of what church is supposed to do. You don't think this is the vicar's fault. You think it's just where you are in things. Instead, you wash the shift from Saturday properly, with hot water that you heat on the small stove, and you scrub it on the board you borrow from Mrs. Burrows, who has the only washboard in the house. And you wring it and hang it, and it joins the one from last night. And now there are 2 shifts drying on the line, and you stand looking at them for a moment with a satisfaction entirely out of proportion to the occasion. Meg comes in with a cup of tea. She hands it to you without ceremony, which is Meg's mode of affection, the direct practical gift with no wrapper on it. Where's Mrs. Burrows, you ask? Her cousin's Sunday dinner. Ah. You drink the tea. It's weak because the tea has been used twice already, the same leaves, but it's hot and it's something. Outside, Sunday Bermondsey is doing what Sunday Bermondsey does, which is a slightly quieter version of every other day. The tanneries on half-time, the streets less packed, the particular atmosphere of a neighbourhood taking one slow breath in the middle of the week's long exhalation. Men outside the public house that opens on Sunday afternoons, women moving between houses, children who've been to church or not, depending, filling the street now with the particular purposefulness of children who've been inside for an hour and need to undo it. You take a walk, not for any specific reason, just to use the Sunday for something that isn't work or waiting. Bermondsey extends south from the river through a grid of streets that were laid down in the 17th and 18th centuries over ground that was once marsh and has never entirely forgotten it. The ground still soft in places, still prone to flooding. The basements of some houses permanently wet in winter. The tanneries cluster near the river, which is where the water they need is, and their smell defines the northern part of the district. Moving south, away from the river, the smell changes, becomes more generically domestic. Coal smoke and cooking and the ordinary effluvia of close living, and the streets widen slightly, and the buildings get newer by increments. Not better, just newer. The buildings in Bermondsey cover a range from the solidly constructed Victorian terraces put up in the last 20 years to the older stock, the courts and alleys and back-to-backs that predate the borough's attempt to organise itself, that were built with the logic of maximum occupancy rather than any other logic, crammed into whatever space was available with walls just thick enough to stand up and roofs just adequate enough to keep the weather broadly out. The house you live in falls somewhere in the middle of this range, not the worst, not the best, and you pass houses that are clearly the worst, where the front step sags and the windows have paper in them rather than glass, and the smell that comes from the entrance is the concentrated smell of many people in a space built for fewer people, and you walk past them without stopping because there's nothing you can do about them, and staring is a form of cruelty. But you look. You look because you're 19, and you haven't yet trained yourself not to, and because looking seems like the minimum courtesy you can offer to the fact of these houses, which is that they exist and people live in them, and those people have inner lives as complex as yours and are not the problem they're made to sound like in the pamphlets. The pamphlets. You've been reading them. Mrs. Beale has a habit of leaving things in the waste bin that are interesting in ways she doesn't intend. Reports from the Vestry Health Committee, copies of the Lancet with articles about sanitary conditions in South London, pamphlets from various reform organisations whose titles range from the businesslike to the religiously alarmed. You read them at the end of the day while you're waiting for Mrs. Beale to count out the wages, and they give you a kind of language for things you've been observing without the vocabulary to describe. The germ theory of disease, for instance. The idea that illness is caused not by bad air or moral failing or divine punishment, but by specific microorganisms, invisible life forms that travel in water and on surfaces and in the air, that can be killed by heat and soap and clean conditions. This is the idea that Pasteur and Koch have been building the evidence for, and that is slowly, unevenly, working its way into the thinking of the men and women who run the sanitary departments of London's boroughs. It explains cholera. It explains the typhoid that runs through the courts and alleys of South London, with a preference for the places where water is scarce and drainage is poor and 10 people share a privy. It does not explain the prevailing attitude toward flannel. The flannel question is something you have encountered in the pamphlets, and something Mrs. Beale has opinions about, and something that several of the women at the laundry have mentioned, and it goes like this. There is a school of thought in Victorian medicine, influential enough to be taken very seriously in respectable quarters, that maintains that the correct approach to undergarments is not to wash them frequently, but to make them of wool or flannel, because wool absorbs the body's perspiration and then releases it, allowing the skin to breathe, whereas linen and cotton trap the moisture against the body and cause illness. This theory has prominent advocates. Dr. Gustav Jaeger, a German naturalist, published a book in 1880 called Discoveries in the World of Dress, in which he argued that animal fibre worn next to the skin was essential to health, that wool and flannel were the only acceptable materials for underlinen, and that the Victorian fashion for white linen shifts and cotton undergarments was directly responsible for a range of illnesses. He was specific and scientific and completely wrong in several important ways, but right in a few coincidental ones, and his ideas found an eager audience in a society that was increasingly anxious about the connection between clothing and health, but hadn't quite worked out the mechanism. The Jaeger Company opened in London in 1884, the same year you arrived, and it sells wool underlinen to people who can afford wool underlinen, which is not people like you, but is a significant portion of the reforming middle class who are already buying Jaeger's book and thinking very hard about their relationship to their own bodies and the clothing adjacent to them. The result of all this is a complicated argument about what poor people should be wearing next to their skin, an argument conducted largely by people who are not poor, in which the hygienic properties of different textile materials are discussed at great length, while the question of whether poor people have access to clean water in which to wash any of these materials is touched on briefly and then set aside. Mrs. Beale has cut through all of this with characteristic efficiency. "Flannel or linen, I don't care," she said once, apropos of something in the waste bin that you'd been reading. "The question is whether it's clean. Nothing keeps you healthy that isn't clean. Nothing." She said this while examining a piece of linen through her steel-rimmed spectacles with an expression of professional judgment that stopped just short of moral condemnation. And you believed her in the way you believe people who have spent their professional lives in direct contact with the subject under discussion. Mrs. Beale has been washing the underlinen of London for 35 years. If anyone has a right to an opinion about underlinen, it's her. Monday comes, the week reconvenes. Something is different now, not dramatically, not in any way that shows on the outside, but in the rhythm of the week. You know, Saturday's coming. You know what Saturday means. The bathhouse on Grange Road has become a fixture in the week, the way the copper boiler is a fixture in the morning, the way the weights of the irons are fixtures, the way the particular bar of pain in your lower back is a fixture, present and expected and integrated into the shape of the days. You go the second Saturday, you go the third. On the fourth Saturday, you go and the second-class cubicle is full, and you have to wait 10 minutes in the lobby, and you wait. And when your turn comes, you get in the bath with the same feeling of specific relief that you had the first time, slightly less overwhelming, but more solid, more settled, the feeling of a known good thing rather than a surprising one. Ellen goes every Saturday. She mentions it to the other women at the laundry in the way that you might mention any regular habit, and some of them listen with interest and some of them already go, and a few of them make the kind of dismissive comment that people make about things they haven't done and don't want to admit they haven't done. Mary Kate says she washes herself properly at the sink every morning and doesn't see the need. You believe her about the sink. You don't comment on the need. Old Grace says she hasn't had a bath since her husband died, and she's 71 and still here, so apparently the lack of bathing isn't killing her. This is probably true, and also probably not the conclusion she means you to draw from it. But Grace is 71 and has earned the right to draw any conclusion she likes. The second month after the first bath, you have 2 shifts in rotation, and you wash one every week and alternate them. This is, objectively, a small thing, a clean shift every week. This is what a slightly better off woman in London in 1884 considers a minimum standard of personal decency. You consider it a triumph. The rag market on Bermondsey Square happens on Fridays and Saturdays, and it is one of the more extraordinary spectacles in a neighbourhood that has a few of them. It starts before light. The sellers come in at 5 or earlier, setting up their stalls or simply laying their goods on the ground on pieces of sacking, and by 7 in the morning the square is a compressed city of second-hand clothing, arranged by some internal principle that you don't fully understand, but that the regular buyers navigate with the confidence of people who've spent years mapping the territory. You come here on a Saturday 3 weeks after your first bath because your coat is not going to see out the winter. This is not an optional observation. The coat is 4 years old, which is old enough, and it has been doing the work of keeping you warm through Bradford winters and then London winters, and the London winters are different from Bradford winters, wetter and less cold but more insistent. The cold that comes off the river and sits in the Bermondsey streets, finding the gaps in the coat and reporting back through them. There's a seam under the left arm that has given up, and there's a spot on the front near the second button where the wool has worn through to something approaching transparency. It keeps you technically covered. It does not keep you warm. A new coat is impossible. A coat from the market is 11 or 12 pence if you know what you're doing, and you don't yet, but Dotty does. And Dotty has the Friday afternoon off because her employer, who she assists with various domestic tasks, including the cooking, has gone to visit her sister in Kew and doesn't need her until Sunday. Dotty moves through the rag market the way Sarah moves through the laundry, with a knowledge that has become physical, that lives in her hands and her eyes rather than in conscious thought. She turns things over, she holds them up against the November morning light, she rubs hems between her fingers, and examines seams and looks at buttons and puts things back down and moves on. She does this quickly, without lingering, which is the correct approach to the rag market, which rewards decisiveness and penalizes the hesitant. You follow her, watching, learning the logic. The market is not organized the way a shop is organized. There is no arrangement by type or size or quality. There is an arrangement by seller, each seller having their particular range, and the knowledge of which sellers are reliable, and which ones are selling things that are in worse condition than they appear, is the kind of knowledge that takes time to accumulate and is not written down anywhere. "Benny," Dotty says, stopping at a stall run by a compact elderly man with a beard and a coat that appears to be made of several other coats, layered on top of each other. He's honest about condition. He'll tell you if something's been patched under the lining. Benny looks at you with the professional assessment of a man who has spent decades evaluating other people's potential as customers. He looks at your coat. He looks at your face. He looks at your hands. "Looking for a coat?" he says, not a question. "Yes." "What do you do?" "Laundress." He nods. This tells him something about the wear and tear a coat will undergo, about what kind of coat will last and what kind won't. He turns to his rack, which is a horizontal pole balanced on two uprights, with maybe 30 coats hanging from it in increasing order of size, and runs his hand along them with a practised ease and pulls out 3. These. You try the first one on. It's a good weight. Dark grey wool, with a collar that still holds its shape and buttons that are all present and correct. The lining is a faded red that's been patched at the hem but not badly. It fits across the shoulders, which is the main thing, because the shoulders are where coats live or die, where alterations become difficult. It's warm. You feel it immediately, the way good wool traps warmth against the body that cheap wool doesn't. 12 pence, Benny says. Dotty makes a sound that is not quite a laugh. 9, she says. He makes a counter-offer. She makes another offer. This goes on for 2 minutes with the speed and informality of a negotiation that both parties have conducted thousands of times, and at the end of it you pay 10 pence and Benny wraps the coat in a piece of newspaper, as if it were a purchase from a shop, and hands it to you with a nod that contains, you think, a small measure of approval, though it might just be commercial satisfaction. Who did this belong to, you ask, holding the coat. Benny shrugs. He doesn't know or doesn't say which in the rag market amounts to the same thing. The history of how goods get from the people who first owned them to the people who need them is a history that the market has learned to make invisible, because the visibility of that history would slow everything down with questions that don't have comfortable answers. The coat might have belonged to a clerk whose household fell into debt, or a woman who died, or a domestic servant dismissed without a character, or someone who needed money more urgently than they needed the coat. The rag market is the clearinghouse for the wreckage of other people's changed circumstances, and it operates on the principle that usefulness is the only question that needs answering. The coat is useful. It fits. The wool is good. The seams are sound. You put it on over your old coat to carry both home, and you're immediately warmer than you have been all morning, and the rag market goes on around you without acknowledging this. The buyers and sellers moving through their transactions, the November light doing its limited best over Bermondsey Square. What Benny doesn't tell you, what nobody at the rag market tells you, because it would destroy the market entirely, is the question that has been troubling the sanitary reformers and the medical establishment in 1884 with increasing urgency. Second-hand clothing spreads disease. This is the thing they're trying to work out how to say. Because the rag market is not just in Bermondsey. There are rag markets all over London, in Petticoat Lane and Brick Lane and the New Cut and a dozen other locations, and every one of them sells clothing that has been worn by other people, whose health at the time of wearing is entirely unknown: smallpox, typhus, scarlet fever. These things travel in clothing, in the fibres of fabric, in the residue of the bodies that wore them. The argument about fumigation has been going on since the 1840s. Should second-hand clothing be disinfected before sale? How would you do that at the scale required? Who would pay for it? If you require it, does the rag market simply move underground or across the river to a jurisdiction that doesn't require it, and then nothing changes except you've added the fiction of regulation on top of the reality of none? This argument is unresolved in 1884. It will remain unresolved for years. The rag market continues because it must, because there is an enormous population of people who cannot afford new clothing, and an enormous supply of clothing whose previous owners no longer need it. And the connection between those two facts is so necessary and so ancient that it resists the kind of regulatory intervention that would make the reformers comfortable. You don't know the full contours of this argument when you carry your 10-penny coat home from Bermondsey Square. You know that Dottie's mother, when she sent Dottie a coat from the market once, included instructions to hang it outside for 3 days and then wash the lining. You know that Mrs. Beale washes her own second-hand purchases before wearing them and has opinions about other people who don't. You know that there are things living in old clothing sometimes, things you'd rather not encounter, lice being the most commonly discussed, bedbugs being a less discussed but equally real possibility. You hang the coat on the hook on the back of the door when you get home, and Dottie produces a piece of something she calls lavender soap, which is mostly lye but smells faintly of something herbal, and you rub it along the seams and the lining and the collar, which is the technique her mother recommended, and then you brush the whole thing out in the yard with Dottie's clothes brush and hang it on the window latch to air overnight. The coat is fine. Nothing happens. You wear it the following Monday, and it keeps you warm, and the split on your knuckle appreciates the warmth rather than the damp cold of the old coat. And by the end of November you've stopped thinking about where the coat came from and started thinking of it simply as your coat. This is how the rag market works, in the end. In the end, the coat is just a coat. The shirt is just a shirt. The history disappears into the present use, and the present use is all that matters when it's cold in November and you have to walk to work before 6. Winter arrives in the way that winter arrives in South London, without drama, without a clear date you could point to, but through a gradual accumulation of symptoms. The standpipe in the yard freezing on the coldest nights, requiring someone to pour hot water on the joint to get it running again, which task falls to whoever gets up first, which is usually you. The fog that comes off the river in the mornings and sits in the streets at chest height until 10 or 11. The particular soup of water vapour and coal smoke and river effluvia, that is the famous London fog, and that is genuinely difficult to breathe, that you taste at the back of your throat and that coats everything it touches with a fine, damp grey film. The cold that moves from outside to inside through the walls of the tenement, finding the gaps, occupying the corners, making the mornings a negotiation between the body's need for warmth and the day's absolute requirement that you get up. The copper at Mrs. Beale's is a blessing in winter. The walk to it in the cold is less of a blessing, but the moment you step into the laundry and feel the heat of the boiler working against your face, the particular enclosed warmth of a working laundry in December, this is a specific and real comfort. Your hands unknot as they warm up. The stiffness in your fingers, which starts every morning as something close to uselessness. The joints refusing to close properly around anything smaller than a bucket handle. This eases over the first hour. Old Grace brings in a pot of something on cold days. She calls it broth, but it's mostly hot water with some flavour in it. Something animal, the end of a bone probably, and a few pieces of whatever vegetable she found cheap. And it's in a pot that she wraps in newspaper and carries under her arm. And at 10 o'clock in the morning in December she opens the pot and everyone drinks a cup. And nobody comments on what it is because what it is doesn't matter. It's hot and it's there. Kindness in the laundry operates on this principle. It happens without announcement. The pot of broth. The fragment of soap that Mary Kate puts on the window ledge sometimes when she's got more than she needs. The way Sarah, who runs the copper boiler and doesn't have to, sometimes adds an extra few minutes to the hot water if you're working through a difficult batch that needs longer. These things don't get mentioned. They happen and are absorbed and constitute the actual economy of the working day, the one that runs underneath the 14 pence and the split knuckles and the ironing room that's too hot. In December, a rumour starts. You first hear it from Meg, who hears everything, who has the particular quality of children in crowded households of being simultaneously invisible to adults and present for all their conversations. Meg mentions it one evening in the way that Meg mentions things flatly, without editorial, handing you the information as she would hand you a cup of tea. Mrs. Griggs says there's been cases, she says. She's on the floor with her mending, 2 streets over. Cases of what, you ask, though you already know from the way she says it. Cholera, she says, or something like. Something like. In South London in the 1880s, something like cholera is a phrase with weight in it. The cholera epidemics of 1832 and 1848 and 1854 and 1866 live in the memory of the older residents of Bermondsey with the weight of personal catastrophe, the weight of specific deaths, of specific doors that closed and didn't open again for weeks. The sanitary reforms that came after the 1866 epidemic, the improved sewerage and the changed water supply, have meant that true epidemic cholera has not returned on the scale of those years, but the fear of it has not gone either. And in winter in the south, London courts and alleys, when the water table is high and the drainage is overwhelmed and people are crowded together in cold rooms breathing each other's air, something like cholera is a phrase that moves from household to household faster than the disease itself. Mrs. Griggs is the wife of your landlord, who appears once a week to collect the rent and otherwise confines himself to the front part of the building. And Mrs. Griggs is the kind of woman who knows everything that happens in a 2-street radius and tells most of it to anyone who'll listen, and the fact that she's the source of this information does not make you feel better about it. You ask Dotty. Dotty knows more. A boy in one of the courts off Druid Street sick 4 days, then dead. An older woman in the same court sick 2 days. The symptoms were diarrhea and vomiting and a kind of rapid collapse that the doctor described to someone who knew someone as being consistent with cholera or a cholera-like illness caused by contaminated water. Contaminated water in December. When the standpipe in your yard has been behaving oddly, the water coming out cloudy some days, which you've been attributing to the frost and not examining too closely, the vestry sends someone. He comes on a Thursday afternoon, a man in a good coat with a notebook and the manner of someone performing an official function that he finds distasteful. He looks at the standpipe and he looks at the privy and he looks at the distance between them and he writes things in his notebook and he looks at the standpipe again and he shakes his head slightly. Not a visible head shake. The kind that lives entirely in the muscles of the neck and communicates disagreement without commitment. He talks to Mr. Griggs, who is summoned from the front of the building. The conversation is conducted at the edge of the yard and you can't hear most of it, but you can see both men's postures, which tell you what you need to know. Mr. Griggs standing with the particular combination of deference and resistance that men in his position perfect over years of dealing with inspectors, accepting the authority while disputing every specific application of it. The inspector making notes and not quite looking at Mr. Griggs directly while he talks. At the end of the conversation, the inspector hands Mr. Griggs a paper. Mr. Griggs looks at the paper with an expression that could be described as pained acceptance if you were feeling charitable toward him. The paper, which you don't read but which Mrs. Griggs describes to Dotty, who describes it to you, requires the drainage between the standpipe and the privy to be properly separated and the standpipe connection to be moved further from the privy, and this work to be completed within 30 days. 30 days in which the standpipe remains where it is. You start boiling the water, not just the water you drink, the water you wash your face with in the morning, the water you rinse the cups in. This requires heating, which requires coal, which costs money, which adds a halfpenny or so a day to the cost of existing in this building, which is money that comes from somewhere else, which is to say nowhere, which is to say it makes other things slightly tighter. But you boil the water. You do this every morning with the focused practicality of someone who has processed the information that contaminated water kills people and come out the other side with a course of action. The germ theory of disease, which has been making its way through the medical journals and out into the popular press, and down through the layers of society in the particular way that important ideas move, slowly and partially, and against considerable resistance, has given you the mechanism to attach this practice to. Boiling water kills what lives in it. This is the part that makes sense. What you haven't fully processed, and what the vestry inspector's visit begins to force you to process, is the scale of the infrastructure problem underneath the domestic problem. The standpipe is too close to the privy. This is true of the standpipe in your yard. It's also true of the standpipes in 3 other yards on your street, all of which are served by the same basic drainage arrangement, all of which have the same proximity problem, all of which the vestry has been notified about over the course of several years and none of which have been properly fixed because fixing them requires the landlord to spend money, and landlords in Bermondsey have discovered over time that spending money on drainage is optional in the sense that it is technically required by law, but the enforcement of this requirement is subject to the 30-day notice period and then a follow-up visit that may or may not happen. And even if it does happen, the penalty for non-compliance is a fine that is less expensive than the drainage repair. You know this. You've learned this in fragments from the pamphlets and from conversations in the laundry and from what you can observe directly. It fills you with the particular quality of anger that is specific to clear understanding of a problem you can't change. The cold, precise anger of someone who has done the arithmetic and found that the numbers don't add up in their favour. The cholera scare passes without becoming an epidemic. The 2 cases in the court off Druid Street are the only cases that anyone official acknowledges in your immediate area, though there are rumours of others that don't get counted because the families involved don't want to be moved to the fever hospital, which is a fear that runs very deep in the communities that know what the fever hospital was like before it was improved and are not confident about how much it's been improved since. But the water stays boiled in your room through January, and the bathhouse on Grange Road has, by January, become something slightly different from what it was in October. In October, you were one of the people who occasionally used it. By January, you're one of the regulars. You know the woman at the counter whose name is Mrs. Holt, and who has the collected manner not of someone indifferent to people, but of someone who has decided that the way to be kind to a large number of people efficiently is to be consistent and reliable, and not to introduce the friction of personal conversation into a transaction that works better without it. She hands you the ticket and the towel, and you go to whichever cubicle is free, and 20 minutes later you come out and she's handing the next person their ticket. You know which cubicles have better hot water, and which have the tap that sticks. You know that if you come just after 1 o'clock on Saturday, which is when the first post-morning rush lulls, you rarely have to wait. You know that the soap provided is replaced on the 1st and 3rd Saturdays of the month, and that on the 2nd and 4th Saturdays it's the stub end of the previous block, which works perfectly well but is smaller. These things constitute knowledge. The particular knowledge of the regular user, the knowledge that makes a public service part of the fabric of a life rather than an occasional luxury. You've been going for 3 months. You'll go next week and the week after and through February and into the spring. Ellen still goes every week. She suggested it to her older sister who came to London in January and is working in a jam factory in Suffolk. The sister went once, then twice, then every Saturday. The number of people who use the Grange Road baths in 1884 is in the thousands per year. This is something you learn from a notice board that gets updated quarterly. The total admissions, the total gallons of water used, the total pennies collected. The numbers are specific and large, and they represent, if you think about them in the way the reformers who built the place probably intended, a collective annual act of the kind of basic self-maintenance that should not require a deliberate decision and a penny and a walk to a public building. But it does. And the thousands of people who make that decision every week are making it in the face of all the reasons not to. The cold mornings, and the tight pennies, and the 20 minutes carved out of the one afternoon that isn't spoken for. And they keep making it anyway, which is a kind of stubborn dignity that doesn't have a name but deserves one. February brings the cold properly. The cold that arrives in Bermondsey with a determination that suggests it intends to stay for some time. The fog thickens. The frost makes the standpipe useless 3 mornings in a row, requiring the hot water routine in addition to the boiling routine, which is a significant amount of early morning management for a morning that starts before 6. Your breath hangs in the air in the bedroom when you get up, which is something Meg has been treating as a form of entertainment, blowing small clouds and watching them disperse, but which you encounter with a more business-like acceptance. The bathhouse in February is different from the bathhouse in October. The warmth of it is more significant. 20 minutes in hot water in the middle of February, when your whole body has been operating at a perpetual slight chill for weeks, when the cold is not just outside but inside, in the house and the laundry and the streets, when you've given up expecting to feel genuinely warm for any extended period. 20 minutes in hot water in February is not an ordinary pleasantness. It is a restoration. You sink into it with the particular physical gratitude of a body that has been waiting for this. You stay the full 20 minutes. Sometimes you stay past the 20 minutes until Mrs. Holt knocks, and the knock comes and you say yes coming and you don't rush. The shift is changed weekly now, without thinking about it. The way you change your stockings weekly. The way you wash your face every morning, built into the rhythm of the week. You don't think about it as an achievement anymore. It has become a practice, a habit. The word habit being important because habits are things you do automatically without the expenditure of resolve, and resolve is a limited resource that you'd rather spend on other things. This is what the reformers wanted ultimately, not the penny, not the building, the habit. The internalization of cleanliness as something that ordinary people do, not as a luxury or a moral statement or a marker of respectability, but as a baseline practice available to anyone, as ordinary as eating and sleeping. They weren't entirely wrong about the goal. They were sometimes spectacularly wrong about the method, about the tone of the approach, about the way that lectures on personal hygiene delivered by people who've never been without hot water to people who've never had it tend to land, which is badly, which is as one more reminder of the distance between the two groups rather than as useful information. But the building is right, the penny is right, the 20 minutes is right, the towel provided is right. Give people access to the thing, and most of them will use the thing. That's all it takes. Most of the time, that's all it takes. By March, the worst of the winter is broken. The particular day that comes every year when the light shifts and you step outside and the cold is still there, but it's lost its authority. It's become the cold of a thing retreating rather than a thing in charge. The fog lifts off the river, the standpipe unfreezes and stays unfrozen. The days are longer by measurable minutes, and those minutes are worth something, worth the difference between walking to work and walking home in darkness and having a half hour of actual daylight on either end. The drain between the standpipe and the privy in your yard is still not fixed. The 30 days came and went, and then 60 days, and the vestry inspector has not returned, and Mr. Griggs has not arranged for the work to be done, and the standpipe still runs close to the privy and you still boil the water. But the cholera scare has faded. The boy who died is buried. The older woman recovered. The court off Druid Street goes back to being the court off Druid Street, with whatever combination of people was in it before, plus the gap where two of them used to be. Mrs. Beale tells you, one April morning, that she has a proposition. She says this at the end of the day, when the wages have been counted and you're putting on your coat, and she says it in the tone she uses for things she's considered carefully and is now presenting as finished thought rather than speculation. I need someone who can do the collars and cuffs regular, she says, every day, not just when I ask. The women who can do them properly are always the ones who leave. She says this without accusation, simply as fact. If you stay, there's an extra penny a day. An extra penny a day. You stand with your coat half on and do the arithmetic that has become involuntary in 14 months of this life. An extra penny a day across 6 days a week is 6p a week, which is roughly double what you've been saving, which is the difference between being able to plan anything and not being able to plan anything. You think about what you'd do with 6 extra pence a week. Better food. Not much better, not dramatically better, but the occasional piece of meat rather than the rare piece of meat. A book, perhaps. a second-hand book from the stall on the Bermondsey Street Market, which you've been looking at for months without buying. The kind of small material margin that changes the quality of being alive in ways that don't show from outside but feel from inside. Like the difference between barely managing and actually managing, and clean underlinen. Not one shift in rotation, 2, 3, the capacity to wash one while wearing another and have a third drying and never reach the point of 3 weeks again. Yes, you say. Mrs. Beale nods. That's the transaction complete. You start Monday. You walk home with the extra penny a day already reshaping the arithmetic of your life, running the numbers without quite meaning to, the way numbers run in the heads of people who live close to margins. The street is doing its spring thing, tentatively. A window box here with something green in it. A woman opening shutters that have been closed all winter. The market on Bermondsey Street with slightly more colour than it's had in months. Someone selling early flowers from a barrow who was not there last week and is there now. You buy a bunch. The flowers cost a halfpenny. They're not much. 6 stems of something yellow, narcissus probably, tied with a bit of string, and they're the kind of thing that has no practical use and will be dead by Thursday, and you carry them home and put them in the cup on the windowsill, and Dotty looks at them and then looks at you with an expression that is somewhere between affection and curiosity. "Good day," she says. "Good day." The cup with the flowers is yellow against the grey of the window, and the grey of the street outside, and the grey of the general February to March sky, and it is so specifically and unnecessarily yellow that it constitutes a small act of defiance against the greyness of everything, which is not something you usually go in for, but which on this particular April evening in Bermondsey seems exactly right. Summer in Bermondsey is a different problem from winter. Winter's problem is cold. Summer's problem is smell and proximity, and the particular quality of a neighbourhood that is built too close and too dense for comfort in warm weather, when the heat presses everyone together and the smells that the cold kept suppressed come out with their full force, and the river at low tide expresses itself across a significant portion of South London. The tannery smell in summer is something that you have to encounter fresh each June, having forgotten during the winter how specifically awful it is at full strength. The June tanneries carry something almost sweet underneath the sulphur, which is worse than the sulphur alone, which gives the whole thing a quality that the brain registers as animal rather than chemical, as the smell of things organic and decomposing rather than things industrial and processed. You adapt to it by July. By August you barely notice. But June is always a reminder. The bathhouse in summer is also different. In winter you go to get warm. In summer you go to wash the day off, which is a different kind of need. The need to not be the person who smells like the laundry and the street and the tannery district after a day of moving between all of them. In summer, the 20 minutes in the bath is a different pleasure. Cooler water, the window of the cubicle open to whatever air is available, the relief not of warmth, but of cleanness, of arriving at the end of a day smelling of soap rather than the accumulated smells of everything else. You go Saturdays and you go sometimes Wednesday evenings, when the days are long enough for there to still be light after work and you can walk to Grange Road, without the dark adding time and difficulty to the journey. The second-class rate is still a penny. Mrs. Holt is still at the counter. The towel is still grey and thin and entirely adequate. Ellen comes on Wednesdays sometimes. She's been talking about the bathhouse to the women she works with, and she reports back on Saturdays the reactions, which are various. 3 women who now go regularly, 1 woman who says it's unnecessary, and tells this to everyone with increasing vehemence that suggests she's arguing with herself rather than with Ellen, and a woman named Clara who tried it once and found it overwhelming. The size of the building, the number of people, the feeling of being in a public institution doing something private and couldn't go back. This last response is real and you understand it. There's a particular vulnerability in the act of bathing, even in a locked cubicle, even in a public building. You're undressed. You're using your own body in a deliberate way, in a public space that has been designated for this purpose, and that designation is still relatively recent. These buildings have only been here for a few decades, and the habit of it, the cultural comfort with it, is not yet settled into the population the way it will be in another generation. You understand Clara's feeling. You felt something like it the first Saturday, standing in the cubicle with the door locked. The strangeness of it, the institutional strangeness, the knowledge that on the other side of a very thin wall someone else is doing exactly what you're doing. But you got into the bath, and then you were just in the bath, and the strangeness faded, and what was left was the bath. Clara will go back eventually, or she won't. You can't make that calculation for her. You can only make it for yourself. By August, you've been in London for 20 months. By August, the penny bath is as unremarkable a feature of your week as the copper boiler at Mrs. Beale's. The cholera scare has been absorbed back into the general texture of living in Bermondsey without proper infrastructure. The drain between the standpipe and the privy is still not fixed, and now it's summer, and the risk is theoretically higher, and still no one has come to fix it, and you still boil the water. You have 3 shifts in rotation. You wash 1 a week. None of them are white anymore. They're the pale grey of cheap cotton that has been through a lot of hot water, but they're clean, and they're yours, and they are washed. One morning in August, towards the end of the month, you arrive at Mrs. Beale's to find old Grace isn't there. Mrs. Beale tells you with her customary efficiency, Grace is ill. Something respiratory, the doctor says. She's at home, which is the upper room of a house 2 streets over where she lives with her daughter and her daughter's husband and their 3 children in 2 rooms. She's 60-something, maybe more, and the respiratory thing has been building since the winter, the particular accumulation of damage that comes from a lifetime of working in steamy rooms with chemical laundry products and breathing the ambient air of Bermondsey. She's not going to die of it. Not yet. But she's not coming back to the laundry, which is what Mrs. Beale communicates with the brief, careful sentence that is her version of eulogy for a work-in situation. Grace won't be back. You work the copper that day. You do Grace's work without being asked to, because someone needs to and because you know how, because Grace has been showing you things without making it explicit that she was showing you things, in the way that very experienced people sometimes teach, by doing the thing near you and letting you watch. At the end of the day, Mrs. Beale says, you handled the copper well. That's Grace's job. Mrs. Beale is telling you that it can be yours if you want it, which comes with another penny a week. Yes, you say, again. Autumn comes again, October again. A full year now from the first bath. The round number feels like something it probably isn't, but you allow it. A year of Saturdays. A year of the penny bath. A year of shifts washed regularly, and collars and cuffs pressed, and old Grace's copper managed with the growing confidence of someone who has been doing something for long enough that the difficulty has become fluency. You're not the same person who walked past the bathhouse for 14 months without going in. You're not dramatically different either. You still live in the same room with Dotty and Meg and Mrs. Burrows. The drain between the standpipe and the privy is still not fixed. a fact that has become something like a dark joke between you and Dotty, marking the passage of time the way other people mark it with anniversaries. You still earn less in a week than the households whose linens you wash spend on a single luxury item. You still eat bread and dripping more often than you eat anything else. But you are warm in your good second-hand coat. You are clean in clean underlinen. You go to the bathhouse every Saturday and sometimes Wednesday evenings, and you feel the specific dignity of this. The dignity that has nothing to do with anyone else's acknowledgement of it. The dignity that exists entirely in the private physical knowledge of being clean. One Sunday in October, a year and a week after your first bath, you walk to London Bridge. Not for any purpose. Dotty is at her cousin's. Mrs. Burrows is at her cousin's. Meg has gone with Dotty. You have the room to yourself for the afternoon and the Sunday stretching out empty, and the particular feeling of unstructured time that, after 22 months in London, you know how to inhabit without anxiety. You just walk. London Bridge is 20 minutes from your door. In 1884, London Bridge is not the current London Bridge, which will come later. This London Bridge, built in 1831, is a relatively plain stone structure. 5 arches, no houses on it, no shops, completely unlike the old London Bridge with its medieval buildings that stood for 700 years. The current bridge is functional and solid, and frankly a little boring, and its boringness is a deliberate and considered improvement over the old bridge, which was romantic and murderous, with its mill-wheel arches that created dangerous racing currents that killed the people reckless or poor enough to try to shoot them. You walk onto the bridge from the south side and stop in the middle. The Thames beneath you is wide and grey-green and moving, the tide going out, the current visible in the surface, the way the water moves not in one direction, but in several simultaneously. The complex hydraulics of a large tidal river expressing themselves in the surface texture. The smell is the river smell, which is its own complicated thing, part sea and part estuary and part the discharge of several million people's daily lives, filtered through the sewer system that Bazalgette built, and then out through the outfalls and back with the tide. It's not a clean smell, but it's a smell with dimensions to it, depth and salt and mud and the organic notes of a living waterway, and on a clear October Sunday with the sun low enough to put gold into the grey of it, it is a smell that belongs to a specific place and contains that place. You lean on the stone parapet and look downstream. The dome of St. Paul's is visible above the North Bank skyline, rising over the jumbled roofscape of the city, with the comfortable authority of something that has been doing this for 200 years and intends to continue. The monument to the Great Fire stands visible from here if you know where to look, a column whose height exactly equals its distance from where the fire started, which you know because Mrs. Beale has a pamphlet about it in her waste bin, and you read it in the Wait Before Wages one Friday evening. The ships in the Pool of London are below the bridge, the massed forest that was denser here a generation ago and is already beginning to thin as the trade moves downstream to the new docks, the larger docks that can handle the larger ships, the steamships that are beginning to replace the sailing ships on the longer routes, the mechanical logic of trade reorganizing itself around the new technology the way it always has. From the bridge you can see both banks, south and north, and they are different worlds and the same world, and the bridge connects them without resolving the difference. North is the city, the commerce, and the institutions, the coffee houses and the counting houses and the offices of the companies, whose linens come to Mrs. Beale's in hampers from Bloomsbury and Mayfair. South is Bermondsey and Southwark, The tanneries and the laundries and the courts and alleys and the standpipe that still isn't fixed. You live on the South Bank. You work on the South Bank. You will almost certainly continue to do so for some years, until you've worked long enough and saved enough and accumulated sufficient reputation in the trade to take the next step toward whatever the next step is, which is not yet fully visible, but is beginning to be thinkable. The man who told you, in Bradford, that London would change you was not specific enough about how. You stand on the bridge for 20 minutes. A steamboat passes underneath with the authority of something that doesn't know the bridges above it. A small sailing boat is going upstream against the current with visible effort, the sail taut, the boat leaning. 2 men on the embankment on the north side are arguing about something, their gestures visible from here, though their words aren't. The city continues its particular Sunday version of itself around you, quieter than other days, but not quiet. The bells of more churches than you can count contributing to the general October Sunday sound of London, which is a sound that you have been hearing for over 2 years now, and that has become, in the way that all constant sounds become, simply the sound of where you are. You push off from the parapet and walk back south, the bridge behind you, Bermondsey ahead, the tannery smell returning as you move south, the familiar greeting of the district you live in. You walk quickly, not because you're late, because it's cold and you're warm inside the good grey coat and the October air is precisely the right temperature for walking quickly, with a purpose that is only direction and not destination. You walk past the bathhouse on the way home. You walk past it the way you now walk past things you know well, without stopping, without the complicated relationship of the unfamiliar. It's a brick building with a notice board outside that you've read 100 times. It will be there on Saturday. The water will be hot. Mrs. Holt will hand you the ticket without comment. It will be there next Saturday and the Saturday after that and into the winter and past it. The particular Tuesday that feels like winter's final announcement, and into the spring that follows, and you will go, and you will be clean, and the shift will be changed weekly, and the split on your knuckle will heal properly for the first time in months, in the clean, dry air of the spring when the damp finally releases its grip on the Bermondsey walls. The evening comes early in October. By the time you're back in the room, the last of the daylight is gone, and Dotty is home, and Meg is home, and Mrs. Burrows is in her chair, and the fire is lit with the week's coal contribution, all 4 of you, and the room is warm for the first time since morning. You sit on the edge of the bed and take off your boots. Outside, Bermondsey is doing what it does in the October evenings, the public houses filling, the tanneries shutting down their processes for the night, the street sounds settling from their daytime pitch to the lower constant hum of a neighbourhood not quite asleep. Somewhere 2 streets over, the court off Druid Street, a dog is barking at something that has been done to or near it, and the barking has the outraged quality of a dog that considers this a matter of principle. You think about the first morning, the cold floor, the grey basin, the shift that had been on for 3 weeks. Then you think about Saturday, the hot water, the clean shift against your skin. Then you stop thinking about it particularly, because thinking about it as a contrast to something past requires holding the past in mind, and the past is the past, and the present is a room with a fire in it, and clean underlinen, and an extra penny a day for the collars and cuffs and old Grace's copper that is now your copper, and the prospect of next Saturday, which is guaranteed to exist barring the kind of catastrophe that can't be planned for. That's not nothing. That's more than not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Dotty is telling Mrs. Burrows something about the cousin, something that requires gesture and a raised voice and occasional laughter, the specific laughter of people who are very comfortable with each other's company, who've been in small rooms together long enough that the edges have worn off, and what's left is mostly ease. Meg is laughing too on the floor at something in Dottie's story that you missed the beginning of. Mrs. Burrows makes her sound, the sound that functions as laughter for a woman who has decided that full laughter is excessive. Her eyes crinkle at the corners. You sit on the edge of the bed and listen to this, and your feet warm up against the floorboards, which are warming up from the fire, which is burning the coal that all four of you contributed to. And you are 20 years old, and you have been in London for 22 months, and you are becoming, slowly and specifically, yourself. Not the self that existed before London, not the Bradford self with the tin bath and the mother's kitchen and the familiar geography of known streets. That self is still in there somewhere, recognizable, accessible. But it isn't the current version. The current version is someone who knows how to negotiate with Benny at the rag market, and how to manage old Grace's copper, and how to run 20 minutes of hot water on a Saturday and arrive on the other side of it clean. The current version is someone who has spent 2 years learning the vocabulary of this particular life. Not in the sense that anyone taught it deliberately, but in the sense that living teaches everything, relentlessly, without announcing the lesson. You pull the blanket up and lie down. The fire pops once. Meg stops laughing at something. Mrs. Burrows says something in her low particular voice, and Dottie responds. The sounds of the room and outside the room. The dog has stopped barking. You are warm. You are fed. You are clean. 3 of the most basic things, not guaranteed, not given. In specific ways, with specific labour, against specific resistance, in a city that doesn't offer them easily to people at your level of things. But tonight, in this moment they are present. Your eyes close. The fire is lower now, the light from it less ambitious. The room settling toward its nighttime temperature, which is not cold tonight, is genuinely warm. The warmth of 4 people in a room with a fire, the accumulated body heat of people who've been living in proximity long enough that the room carries their presence. You think, briefly and without much force, about what next year will look like. The copper, the collars and cuffs, the bathhouse on Saturdays, the rag market in autumn when the coat needs something, some small repair, some replacement. The drain between the standpipe and the privy still not fixed probably, the water still boiled, every morning. Some things change and some things don't. The ones that don't change are sometimes the most important ones, the ones where the infrastructure refuses to improve no matter how many letters the vestry writes or inspectors knock on doors. Those things change slowly or not at all, and the people who live with them adapt or don't, and the adapting is what it looks like from inside, from the daily level of waking up and finding the path through the day. But the other things, the things that were within the reach of a person with a penny and a Saturday afternoon, and the willingness to go, to actually go, to step through the door of the building they've been walking past for 14 months, those things change. You changed. You stood still for 14 months and then you went. And that's the part that stays with you as the fire drops to embers and the room goes dark and Dottie's breathing slows beside you into the rhythm of sleep, and Meg is already there, on the floor with her blanket, long gone. The part that stays is not the bath itself, the specific texture of the towel, or the sound of the hot water filling the cast iron tub, though those things are real and they're good. The part that stays is the decision. The Saturday when the possible thing finally stopped appearing impossible. Because the water was always hot. The building was always there. The penny was always, with effort, findable. The only thing that changed was that you walk through the door, and now it is a year and a week since you walked through the door, and the door is ordinary to you now, and next Saturday you will walk through it again without any of the complicated feeling of that first Saturday, just with the knowledge of what's on the other side. Outside, London continues its nighttime version of itself, the last of the public house traffic, the night carts moving through the streets, the watermen still out on the river, though fewer of them. The river sounds quieter at this hour, the water doing what it always does, moving against the tide and with the tide and around the bridge piers and past the wharves and out toward the estuary. The bells mark the hours, as they always do. You don't count which one. You don't. You're already asleep. The room breathes around you. The fire dies down to nothing. The building settles. The city outside goes on in the particular way that cities go on at night, with the diminished urgency of a thing that knows it will be fully itself again in a few hours, but is content for now to keep its voice down. You sleep, and in the morning you'll wake before 6, before the bells, the alarm in your chest that has been calibrated by 22 months of necessity to this particular hour, this particular requirement. You'll put your feet on the cold floor. You'll wash your face in the basin. You'll put on your clean shift, the one from Saturday, the one that smells of laundry soap and nothing else. You'll put on your boots and your coat, and you'll step out into Bermondsey in the morning, into the tannery smell and the coal smoke and the October cold and the standpipe that still isn't fixed, and the streets that are already moving at this hour, the human machinery of the district starting its daily processes, and you'll carry with you, underneath all of it, the simple private knowledge of clean skin. That's what no one can take. Not the landlord who won't fix the drain. Not the vestry inspector who fills notebooks and writes notices that go unanswered. Not the employers who pay 14 pence and consider it sufficient. Not the winters. Not the split knuckles. Underneath everything, the clean shift. Underneath everything, the bathhouse on Grange Road. Underneath everything, the Saturday afternoon, and the penny, and the 20 minutes that you claimed from the week and the city and the particular grinding machinery of this life, and said, "This is mine, this ordinary decency is mine, and I am going to have it. Let it all settle now. Let the Bermondsey sounds come down around you like a blanket. The last cart on the street below, the dog starting up again briefly and then stopping, the river, which you can't hear from here but which is there anyway, moving through the dark with its usual indifference to whether anyone is watching. Let your hand stop, the split on the knuckle, the ache across the lower back, the muscles in the arms that have been carrying and wringing and ironing since 6 in the morning, carrying the day's work like freight, like the actual weight of what it costs to be alive here. Let it all go. You've earned this, not the sleep specifically. You've earned the specific particular right to be clean when you close your eyes, to carry the smell of soap into your dreams, to wake up tomorrow still in clean underlinen in the same bed in the same Bermondsey room and know that Saturday's coming, that Saturday's always coming, that the penny bath on Grange Road will be open, and Mrs. Holt will be at the counter, and the hot water will run. That's real. That's yours. That happened. Let it come. The dark room, the slow breathing, the fire that's just warmth now, just residual warmth in the bricks. Let the city hold you in the way that cities hold the people who live in them, impersonally and completely, the way the river holds the boats, just enough. You're warm enough, safe enough, clean enough. That's enough. That's exactly enough. The bell's somewhere, counting an hour you're too far gone to catch. 1, 2, and then nothing. Just the dark. Just the long reach of sleep. Just rest, Agnes. You've worked hard enough today. Good night.